to the survey form. I also want to say thank you to all those who took time to respond to the survey form, which was sent before the webinar, which was in some way preparing us on the topic, common challenges of active and passive learning and teaching. I got your views with respect to the pictures and questions which were asked, and what really caught my attention was the fourth question, the last question, which required us to identify the activity carried out by those on the picture, and 100% all of us did agree that they were carrying out a discussion, a group discussion. So today we'll be looking at how we can overcome the problems which comes with active and passive learning. In this session, we'll explore the different ways of carrying out active and passive teaching and learning. We'll also evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of passive and active learning, as well as identify the drawbacks and some strategies we can use to overcome the issues which comes with passive and active learning. As our agenda, we'll begin by looking at the background knowledge of passive and active teaching, where it all started. We'll also look at the difference between passive and active learning. We'll look at the advantages, disadvantages, the challenges, and how we can overcome them. So let's begin. How did it all begin? As teachers, we realize that day to day, as day goes by, in terms of improvement in technology, that has really had a great impact on our learners and the way they are able to share and take in information. And because of this fact, we need to step up our game. We need to look for ways to empower our students such that they play different and more roles in our classrooms, such that they tend to enjoy their learning. Now, because of our different background, we're able to come up with different resources and different ways of carrying out our teaching and learning process. And while adapting our learning styles to our backgrounds and our environment, there are some challenges which we face. Now, these challenges are not just for you, or you're not the only one facing these challenges, but we also face them, whether we carry out our lessons both face-to-face and online. I mean, most teachers complained during the COVID pandemic period about how they will be able to adapt their learning and make it much more enjoyable. But unfortunately, even when it comes to face-to-face learning and teaching, we do still face these challenges. We tend to ask ourselves, how can we make our teaching more enjoyable? How can we engage our learners more? How can the content of our teaching be more engaging? What are the things we can do to get our learners more involved in our teaching? Now, we're able to come up with two strategies which could help us sail through. One of them is passive and active learning. Now, these terms have often been looked at and used to describe the way learners are able to acquire and process knowledge. And so that is why we want to take a look at it today during this webinar. Now, what is passive and active learning? Now, when it comes to passive learning, according to Drew, it has to do with transmitting information from teacher to learner. But now, interaction is more of teacher-centered rather than learner-centered. So what is the concern of the teacher is for the students to just acquire or absorb knowledge and not do anything about it. So in that case, they are more passive. So what are they there to do? Just listen, read. You get teachers just asking students, read what's on the board, or they listen to teachers while they speak all through without interacting. However, when it comes to active learning, Felder and Brent 2009 defines it as anything course related that all students in the class session are called upon to do other than simply watching, listening, and taking notes. So we discovered that when it comes to active learning, it's more student-centered, while passive learning is more teacher-centered. So during active learning, students are highly engaged. We find them getting involved in the teaching learning process, and that way they're able to understand the content more. Now, we will do a little bit of exercise, and I would like to see your comments on the chat box. Now, what are some methods which we can use in carrying out active and passive learning? Share your views on the chat box, please. What do you think, depending on your background or your environment or your classroom situations? What methods do you think could be used in applying passive or active learning? Reading for comprehension, okay, group discussion for active, passive reading, active role play, wow, yes, okay, discussion method. Okay, for active learning, we have group work, hands-on, role play. Wow, very interesting comments coming here. Oh, extracurricular activities, lecturing passive. Exactly. We get a lot of people saying lecturing is more of passive. Yes, peer teaching. Thank you all for your amazing comments. Now let's take a look. Now, we'll look at the methods used for active learning and teaching and passive learning methods. Now, with active learning, like you rightly said, discussions could be carried out in class. These discussions, depending on the number of students we have, we'll know whether we'll put them in small groups or why not the whole class seated together. Also, individual and group projects, we can ask them, like I said, depending on your class situation. There are classes where you have more than 50. In that case, you definitely need to put them in groups. But very least small classes, we can give them tasks where they can carry out projects individually. We can also give them time to reflect and come up with what they think about. And why not? We can pair them such that one student could also discuss with another student, because sometimes the way we teach, we may feel that the students understand, but they may learn better when they get to interact with each other. In that case, we're applying the peer-to-peer teaching. How about role play, which was really discussed yesterday during the first webinar? The presenter really spoke about how we can act to get learners involved in our classrooms. And also games and problem solving is one method we can apply when we want to use the active learning and teaching method. Now, with a passive learning and teaching method, it will be more of lectures, presentations. Of course, when we say lectures, where the teacher does all the talking, and then presentations. Sometimes we can get a student to come and present to the whole class while the rest of the class are looking at them. That was really seen in picture 2 during the on the survey form. We can also talk about reading, lectures, and presentations when the class size is so large. We can also show them videos and textbooks and note taking. Those are the different methods which we can use or we can apply when carrying out either passive or active learning method. Now, what is the difference? What's the difference between active and passive learning? Once again, I would like to get your comments on the chat box. What do you think is the difference between passive and active learning? What's the difference? Okay, passive is teacher-oriented, yes. Active, direct interaction. Passive, just listen. Active is more practical than passive, yes. Teacher-based, passive. Okay, Nelida says input and output. I hope you can throw more light on that. Active learner centered. Wow, very interesting comments from you there. Madelena says the learners are more active and make decisions. Passive, student-centered. Okay, passive is more of teacher-centered, active is learner-centered. Passive, focus on action. Oh, thank you all for your nice input on the chat box. Now, let's look at the difference between active and passive learning. Now, like most of us rightly said, when it comes to passive learning, focus is more on the teacher. So you get a classroom scenario where everyone is watching, looking at the teacher, and the teacher does all the talking. Less interaction from students, little or no interaction from students. Unlike active learning, where you find students either talking to each other or responding to the teacher or talking with the teacher, like the class is always very active. Also, with passive learning, focus more is acquiring knowledge, assimilating it, and giving feedback if necessary. So it's more of a robotic stage of learning or process of learning. However, when it comes to active learning, we expect students to get the knowledge, yes, think about it, talk about it with us, with teachers, with their peers, talk about it as a group, ask questions if necessary, master the knowledge, and make use of it. With passive learning, it encourages students to listen more and pay attention to the details of what is being taught. So you get scenarios where during the class, the teacher will just ask, have you understood? And everybody's yes, and he or she will move ahead. However, with active learning, we will ask prompt questions, expect the students to react, give their own point of views, and maybe sometimes it may even prompt them to engage in a debate during the class. In that case, we are sure that our learning scenario is more of active than passive. Now, what are the advantages of passive and active learning? Now, when it comes to passive, the advantage there is no matter how voluminous your material may be, you'll be able to cover all as a teacher because you do all the talking. All right. And another advantage is you'll be able to give instructions because you do not get any feedback. You'll be able to give instructions and tell them what to do and for them to just repeat or reproduce what you want them to do. Also, it's easy to plan a passive learning scenario because you know what you want to give to them at every stage of the lesson. And also you have control over the material you're supposed to give and deliver to the learners. Now, let's look at the advantage of active. With active learning, because the students get the information, think about it, it helps improve their critical thinking skills. That explains why they'll be moved to get involved or engaged in debates during the class. Also, because students are engaged, it helps them to be attentive because they are sure that during this lesson, they won't feel bored. It helps to also empower our students, to make them feel useful, to make them feel encouraged, make them enjoy the lesson, and make them more confident when they're using the language. It also helps them remember to retain what is being learned and for them to use it because they are involved all through the lesson. When going back home, it will stick in their minds and they'll be moved to use them. And it's also an opportunity for them to collaborate and discuss with their peers. In class scenarios where there are so many, there are some students who get all through the year without getting to know their classmates, all their classmates. But through active learning or active teaching, they are able to collaborate and interact with their classmates. Now, despite the advantages, there are some drawbacks or problems which come along with it. With passive learning, what happens is students just because we are just passive, they just know how to repeat or reproduce what we have given to them. Also, it discourages students from contributing or asking questions. That explains why at the end, when a teacher says, have you understood? The only automatic answer you hear is yes. Whether they have understood or not, they just want you to get over and done with the lesson. Now, there is also a problem of difficulty in terms of knowing whether a student has really understood or comprehended the lesson or not, because we are focused on ourselves and not on the students. There's another problem with passive is students tend to be more focused on the physical appearance of the teacher. They are not worried about what the teacher is saying. So their personality, how they present the lesson, that's what's their focus, and that is what they will retain. Also, we will not expect them to be fully engaged, and we'll also not expect them to retain anything, because sometimes because they are not involved in the lesson, they have little to remember. And also, another disadvantage of passive learning is in terms of material, we'll not really have enough material to give the learners such that they can enjoy the lesson. Now, with active learning, the disadvantage of active learning is that with introvert learners, because they don't like to speak and interact, it may make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. Another disadvantage is that with active learning, the teacher may sometimes lose control over the learners because they get so active. The class may go overboard, and to get them into the lesson may be a little bit worrisome. So the fact that a teacher needs to be more flexible, more prepared, may put a lot of pressure on the teacher. And also, another drawback is too much talking may get us out of our lesson. Now, I want us to observe something. When it comes to the advantages, we realize that we have more advantages for active and less for passive. And when it comes to the drawbacks, we realize that we have more drawbacks for passive and less drawbacks for active. So what are we saying? We're not saying that passive is so bad and active is so good, or passive is so good and active is so bad. Both are good, both are to be used, but they both have the good sides and their bad sides. Now, despite these drawbacks, how do you think we can overcome these challenges? Once again, let's talk in the chat box. What do you think we can do to overcome these challenges? Okay, someone says balance, mix. Yes, thank you. Both methods have to be infused. Yes, Marcia says use both in the lesson. Victoria says both are integral. Share knowledge, encourage participation through honest praise. Zainab says both. Ija says apply both methods. Alphonse says thoughtful integration. Okay, mix both in a lesson. Very interesting comments. Yes, balance between both. And someone says we should use a combination of, wow, give students autonomy, all right? More of teacher-centered and less student-centered. Okay. Making students reflect more on those advantages and disadvantages, for example. That's Madelana. Okay, Evelyn says a little bit of both. Thank you all for your wonderful comments. So, like we rightly said, yes, the one way or the best way of overcoming these challenges is using them together. Yes, we need to try to achieve a balance between passive and active, because in reality, there are some lessons where a teacher needs to be passive. You need to gain control of your lesson for the learners to comprehend or encourage or incorporate what you're about to teach them. However, you will not want to make it solely passive, because in that case, we are going to face more of the effects or the drawbacks of a passive learning. But now when we blend both, we discover that the learners will benefit and we too will benefit. So yeah, a few tips to help us achieve this balance. One of them is encourage movement between styles. What do we mean? So when we are moving from passive to active, it's not like we're going to tell the students that, okay, now we are moving from passive to active. But now while preparing our lesson, we'll have to look for games or activities which will help us to be able to transit smoothly from one of these teaching methods to another. Now, if our lesson for that day is going to be more of a passive lesson, why don't we break it into bits and pieces by maybe adding up stages where students have to answer our questions and prompt them to ask questions, ask them, maybe they take a break, they move around the class, maybe you give an activity or a game for them to play. Yes, sometimes we can even challenge them by raising an argument, a pertinent argument, which might incite them to speak, to get their own point of view based on what you are, or based on what you are teaching. In that case, or in that way, we will be blending both teaching methods, and we'll also be making our learning environment more enjoyable and more enjoyable. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. That was so interesting. And I'm sure, like me, many people listening really recognize and identify with both the positives and the negatives on both sides. So I love the fact that it was balanced, that you're saying it's not all one or all another. So thank you. Really, really interesting. And as the questions are coming in, actually, I've got a question.
Okay.
So you're talking about we need a bit of both. What's the ideal balance, do you think, between active and passive? Is it 50% of the time? Is it like 50-50?
In reality, it's hard to have a 50-50% balance. But what I would say is, depending on your learners and depending on the lesson. Now, sometimes the lesson may require a 7, as if we have to put it in a 70-30 percentage, if we have to put it in percentage. And
Right.
Sometimes it may require more or less. Sometimes it may also require an equal balance. So, for example, at the class today, if you don't mind, I may share my experience. And at the class was, initially, I felt the class needed to be passive because it's something I'm introducing to the learners. But fortunately, because of how much we had talked about that topic before the lesson of today, I realized the class turned out to be more active than passive. So while preparing the lesson, it was more 70-30, 70 passive, 30 active. But it turned out to be the other way around. It turned out to be 70 active and 30 passive. So depending on the learners and what you have to teach on that day, will you know what amount of interaction? But we need to also have that while planning, that at some point we need to make our classes active so that they too can enjoy the lessons.
Right, that's so interesting. Sometimes I think we as teachers feel a pressure that I need to teach this, and the curriculum says I have to cover all of this. But when you actually start listening and responding to your students, you realize it's much better when they're engaged and maybe they know more than you think. Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in, so let's go to some of these. Okay, this is kind of what I was maybe just mentioning. So this is a question from Dr. Vinitha. Can all concepts or aspects of a syllabus be taught with the active method?
Well, I won't say yes and I won't say no, because when we talk about concepts in the curriculum, now if it's in terms of English language curriculum, we won't say all concepts can be taught using the active, because there are some notions which we need the learners to know for them to use it. So if they don't get to understand the principle, understand what these concepts are, it will be difficult for them to use it. So before we get to the usage part, we need to teach them, we need to incorporate. And in that, at that particular point, we are more of passive teachers than active. Now, when it comes to applying and using the knowledge, now we are more active. So I won't say yes, all concepts, or no, no concepts. It boils down to what I said earlier. It depends on your classroom scenario. It depends on your academic milieu. It depends on your background.
Okay, right, thank you. Okay, another question for you. So this is from Tesfaye. Do we really say active and passive in terms of the teacher or the learner, or is it more active passive teaching or active passive learning?
Okay, that's quite interesting, because while coming up with this topic, I also had that worrying whether it's just learning or it's just teaching. When I first of all said active learning, it felt like I was so concerned about the students. And when I changed the topic to active and passive teaching, it felt like I was more concerned about the teachers. So I decided to put teaching and learning for us to be aware that it's a two-way traffic, it's a two-way thing. So it's me and it's us and them, and not just them and or just us. So while we are teaching, they are learning. And while they are learning, we are teaching. So if we are acting as active teachers, they too will be learning as active learners. But if we are passive, they too will be passive. So when I go to class and I decide to be a passive teacher, what's the response? They won't react, they won't interact. And in that case, they're learning passively. But if I decide to be interactive, they too will move with the flow, and they too will be active learners. So it's a two-way something. So if you make yourself active, they will.
Actually, you've just made me think of another possible advantage of active teaching and learning styles, which is that you know in the moment if they're getting it. You have more feedback. And
yes.
Sometimes what you think you've covered, you know, you're using a passive style, right? Okay, I've definitely explained this really well. And then when you get the homework back or in the exam, you think, oh, actually,
exactly,
they didn't
not
get
doing
it.
anything. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. This is so interesting. Such an interesting topic. We've got loads of questions here. One is from Nabila. So, how about big classes? How would you apply active learning effectively?
Well, because we are gradually, like I said earlier, we evolve with evolution of technology and all the like, we're trying to help even that class of individuals to see how important it is to be more actively involved in learning. Because when you see what they are able to achieve because they are passive during the classroom setting, you discover that it doesn't make learning interesting. Day to day, we're looking for ways through which people will learn, students or people will learn without feeling that they are learning. People will learn and enjoy learning. So I think with the classics, if we have to help by adapting our teachings gradually, of course, because you will not just do that automatically. It can get into some form of shock. It will be very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So continuing a little bit with this idea about kind of the preferences of the learner and thinking what the learner needs. There was an interesting question about, where was it now? I've lost. It was when I have students who are being passive, this is from Nelida, how could I push them to be more active?
Okay, that's quite a nice question. So like we said, one of the problems with drawbacks of active learning was that it's usually a problem with introverts, and passive learners are generally introverts. Now, when it comes to group tasks, you can either blend them with groups. Avoid putting passive learners together. When you put them together, it won't help them move from being passive to active. And also remember, we are not trying to make these passive learners 100% active, because it's a gradual process. They have their own problems and their own weaknesses, and then they have other issues which could be a contributing factor as to how they are able to acquire knowledge. So we will try that gradually. I remember when I just started my teaching career, that was quite a challenge for me. I didn't understand why a student would sit and look at me and not want to say anything in class. And I will insist, you must speak or you'll be punished. But after gaining a lot of experience doing some research, participating and talking with others, I did that, I think, a year ago or two, where I had this student who will not like to talk to people in class and will always want to be on his own. So what I did was, when he gets to a group, he will make everybody very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable, and people will complain. So I had to swap the groups all through the academic year till he found the group he could perfectly blend. So sometimes giving group tasks and making these passive learners move, not just be comfortable in one zone, and move from one group to another, work with different peers, speak with their peers, speak even with you. It can be helpful.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So that's a really interesting, that's great. So you kind of push them, but just step by step, like you say, not too much, maybe with a partner,
exactly.
Not in a big group. And I like what you're saying about thinking about the social element. So some people are comfortable with one partner, but not with another.
Not with so many persons, exactly.
Yes, okay. Okay, great. Let's see if we can answer some more of these questions. You can have a look as well in the question and answer section, see if there's anything that you particularly want to answer. So one question from Holly is, do you find when you're making changes from passive to active and vice versa, are you doing that? I thought she was going to say, is it difficult, the transition? So the question is, do you do that every class? I think we covered that, didn't we? That you would do a mixture, is that right?
Exactly. Yes, I was about saying that it's still the same thing I said. When sometimes you prepare for a lesson and feel, okay, it's going to be passive, and then you end up it turns out to be an active class. So I think adaptability is the word. Should just be adaptable, be open. When we need to, let me not say we must, we need to prepare before going to the classroom, such that while preparing, we are open-minded, ready for anything that comes to us. So having this knowledge of active and passive really helps me, knowing that the class may turn out to be something which I did not expect. Now, as a teacher, how do I adapt? Mm-hmm. Now, preparing before going to class will help me to easily transition. But now when I do not prepare, sometimes if you're taking unaware, it happens. I'm not saying you should, but then it may. So if we don't prepare and you're taking unaware, then that's where it may be a problem. But trust me, if you prepare before going to a class, I'm not sure transitioning from passive to active will be a problem, because you just move with the flow and everybody's going to enjoy at the end of the day.
Yes, you develop that instinct, don't you, for when it's the moment to change.
Yes.
If you're prepared, like you say, maybe you've got different options for like the end of the class. Sometimes there's lots of energy, so you leave them on their group work, or maybe it's like, okay, I need quieter time. Okay, so there's a question from Ahmed. If some students are demotivated, how can we motivate them?
Okay, I think in terms of demotivation, we really need to know what is the cause of their demotivation. it's motivated because of the lesson? Are they demotivated because of their social issues? Are they demotivated because it's their personality? Or maybe pressures, peer pressure could also be a cause. Now, I want to talk about demotivation in terms of the language. I'll use this experience to answer that. At the beginning of this academic year, a student walked up to me, and because I teach French learners, walked up to me and she told me she loves English language, but she feels she will never know English language. And there is no way she will ever acquire the language. And I just told her, do these 3 things for me. Be present in class, sit at the first desk, and do all the homework. She said, Madam, I said, that's all. That's all I need from you. You see, so at the beginning of the year, she always had me, but I needed her to do it voluntarily. So 2 weeks after lessons, I noticed she was sitting in front. And then the homework she didn't do, the other homeworks she did. And today, one of the things we did in class was I had to hand them their assessment papers. And she did so well, surprisingly. She did so well. So she was demotivated at the beginning. I don't know why, but because she walked up to me, I understood the fact that she could not understand English was already a problem for her. So I didn't want to understand where it's coming from. I just wanted us to deal with the fact that English language was a problem. So sometimes finding out the cause of demotivation is one step towards helping helping a learner. If it's about the language, then there are so many methods you can apply. If it's about the language, you start with building love and desire to learn the language. Yes, it can help encouraging them to interact with their classmates who master the language a little bit can also be very helpful.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's really interesting. It's so interesting to hear your classroom examples and examples of real students. And I love the way in that one you just said, look, all you need to do is this, this, and this. So sit here, do this, and that you're kind of breaking it down. But it's interesting how later she actually did well and was motivated.
Yes.
So it's almost
I'm particularly touched with that experience because when I was marking the scripts, I didn't really know her name until when she came to take her script. I was so touched. I was really happy, and I encouraged her. Yes, I was so touched by that particular example. And I want to say thank you to the person who asked that question. At least you gave me the opportunity to share the experience to the whole world. It was Church Day.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a beautiful note to finish on, that heartwarming story of how your student, with a bit of personal attention, kind of blossomed. No, she just did those 3 simple things and then found that she got the results, and I'm sure the motivation came then. So that's great. Thank you so much. I wish we had time for more. We've got so many questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to answer, but everybody, you can, in fact, let's just, if you could stop sharing your presentation, just to finish. We could have done that before, but anyway. So yeah, don't forget that you've got all the information around this session on the handout, so you can read more about this topic. Really, really interesting. And thank you very much. It's just been so great to have you here. So thank you to all our moderators.
Thank you, Joanna.
Kath,
thank you, everyone. Gary,
and yes, thanks so much. So we'll be starting the next session in 15 minutes. You've got a quick break. But thanks so much to Nkumbe.
Thank you too.
Right, see you soon, everybody. See you in the next session.